On Mother's Day, I received a card and my daughter insisted I read it out loud. Tulips are pink, daisies are white. You're a constant weight. No one wants you around. Everyone laughed at me. My name is Helen. I'm 72 years old, and that was the deepest humiliation of my life. It was a Sunday morning. The sunlight poured through the living room windows when I arrived at my daughter Melissa's house in Brookfield to celebrate my day. I was wearing my favourite maroon dress, the one that always made me feel refined. I had brought fresh peonies and little pastries for my grandkids. "Grandma Helen!" the youngest one shouted, running toward me. Their hugs filled my heart with joy. For a moment, everything seemed perfect. Ethan, my son-in-law, greeted me with a brief, cold nod. Melissa came out of the kitchen with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mum, I'm glad you made it. We have a special surprise for you." I sat on the sofa, surrounded by my family. The kids gathered at my feet, buzzing with excitement. Melissa pulled a lilac card from her purse and handed it to me. "It's from all of us, Mom. Read it aloud so everyone can hear." My fingers shook slightly as I opened the envelope. The card was covered with childish doodles the kids had drawn. How lovely, I thought. I began to read in a bright, steady voice. "Tulips are pink, daisies are—" My voice cracked. The next line struck me like stones. "You're a constant weight. No one wants you around. Your time is over. It's time for you to leave. Signed, your family who can't stand you anymore." The silence lasted for 3 unbearable seconds. Then Ethan burst out laughing, a sharp, cruel sound. Melissa covered her mouth, but I saw the amusement in her eyes. Even the children, not truly understanding, giggled because their parents were laughing. "Did you see your face, Mom?" Melissa managed between laughs. "Ethan, did you get a photo?" My heart broke. Tears rolled down my lined cheeks. The card slipped from my trembling hands and fell to the floor. "It's just a joke, Mom," Melissa continued, but her tone carried no regret. "Don't be so sensitive. You've always been dramatic." Ethan bent to pick the card up from the floor. "Yeah, Helen, we were just kidding around, but you know," he paused awkwardly, "lately you've been a bit too present. Maybe you should think about alternatives." "Alternatives?" I repeated, my voice barely holding. "Well, you know," Melissa said, sitting across from me. "There are some really nice retirement places for people your age. You could be with friends your own age, more comfortable." The phrase retirement places echoed in my mind like a sentence. My own children wanted to discard me like worn-out furniture. But I thought, I whispered. "I thought I was coming to celebrate Mother's Day with you." "And you are, Mom," Ethan said with a patronizing tone. "It's just time to be realistic. You're not young anymore. You need more care, and we have our own lives." The children looked at me, puzzled. The oldest, barely 8 years old, came over and took my hand. "Grandma, why are you crying?" Before I could reply, Melissa pulled him away. "Come here, sweetheart. Grandma's fine. She's just feeling emotional." I sat there, more alone than I had ever been in my life. On the day meant to honor motherhood, my own daughter had turned me into the family's cruelest punchline. Slowly I stood up, my legs shaking. I should go." "Okay, Mom." Melissa didn't even rise to say goodbye. "We'll call you later." I walked to the door with whatever dignity I had left, though inside, my world had completely collapsed. That night, in my silent house, I cried until there were no more tears left. But something inside me shifted. The humiliation had awakened something that had slept for years. It was time for my family to learn who Helen really was. The next morning, I blocked them all. But first, I needed to understand how I had ended up in such pain. I sat down in my favorite armchair, the same one where I had nursed Melissa 44 years earlier, and let my memories play like an old film in my mind. It all began when I was 30 years old. Melissa's father had left us when she was only 3. One morning, he simply wasn't there anymore. He had left a note on the kitchen counter. "I can't live this life. I'm sorry." He didn't even say goodbye to his daughter. I remember that night, holding Melissa as she sobbed, calling for her dad. "Daddy had to go far away, my love," I whispered, vowing that she would never want for anything, and I kept that promise. I worked double shifts at the garment factory for 14 years. My hands were rough from stitching uniforms deep into the night. Every extra cent I saved went toward Melissa's education. When she was 17 and wanted to study nursing, I sold my grandmother's pendant, the only valuable thing I owned. But when I saw the light in my daughter's eyes as she spoke of her dream, I knew it was worth every sacrifice, and I didn't hesitate for a moment. "Mum, are you sure?" she asked me that day, truly uncertain. "My love, your education is what matters most." During her 4 years of college, I spent weekends cleaning office buildings. I'd come home with an aching back. But every time I saw Melissa studying at the dining table, it was all worth it. On her graduation day, I cried tears of pride. "We did it, Mom," she said, hugging me tightly. "None of this would have been possible without you." Later, she met Ethan. At first, I liked him. He was courteous, diligent, and seemed to love her sincerely. When they married, I paid half of the wedding expenses. It was $11,000 I had been saving for years. But I wanted my daughter to have the celebration she dreamed of. "Mom, this is too much," Melissa protested when I handed her the check. "Nonsense," I said with a smile. "It's the biggest day of your life. You deserve it." When they bought their first house, I gave them the down payment, $27,000. It was everything I'd managed to save, but seeing them happy in their own home filled me with joy. Then came the grandkids, 2 beautiful children who became the light of my world. When Melissa returned to work after maternity leave, I became their unpaid babysitter. Every morning for 3 years, I walked nearly 7 blocks to their house at 6 a.m. I made breakfast, dressed the kids, took them to the park, fed them lunch, bathed them, and read stories before bed. When Melissa returned from work, the house was tidy and the children were cheerful. "I don't know what we'd do without you, Mom," Melissa often told me back then. "You're a blessing." But little by little things changed. Gratitude became rare. My advice about the children started to sound like unwanted interference. When I suggested that the youngest see the doctor for his lingering cough, Ethan said, "Helen, who's the parent here?" The first time they spoke to me like that, I stayed silent. I thought maybe I had overstepped. But then came the small remarks. "Mom, you don't have the energy you used to for watching the kids. Helen, I think you mixed up their vitamins again. Maybe it's best if you rest at home more." Yet, I kept coming every day. I kept helping. I kept giving all I had. 2 years ago, when Ethan lost his job, I began giving them $550 a month so they wouldn't lose the house. "It's just temporary," they said, "until Ethan finds something better." Ethan found a new job 6 months later, but they never told me to stop sending the money. They just kept accepting it as if it were their right. When the children needed new laptops for school, I paid $1,900 without being asked. When Melissa's car broke down, I gave them $40,200 for repairs. When they decided to remodel the kitchen, I contributed $7,500. Gradually, I became the invisible provider, always there to fix their problems, never included in the family's important choices. A year ago, Melissa organized a family dinner for Ethan's birthday. I found out by chance when one of my grandkids mentioned the secret party. "Why didn't you invite me?" I asked Melissa over the phone. "Oh, Mom, it was a small thing, just us 4. You'd have been bored." But I saw the photos online. 20 people, all Ethan's relatives. Many I knew well. Everyone had been invited except me. That night, I cried quietly, but I told myself it must have been a mistake. Mistakes became habits. They forgot my birthday. They cancelled our lunch plans. When I dropped by unannounced, they looked annoyed by my presence, but the breaking point came 3 months ago. I was helping prepare dinner when I overheard Ethan talking on the patio. Yeah, my mother-in-law lives alone. She's becoming pretty dependent. No, she's not sick, but you know how it is at that age. Yeah, we're looking into places where she can be properly cared for. I froze by the doorway. My own son-in-law was planning to discard me like I was old furniture. That night, I couldn't sleep. I had given everything, my time, my savings, my love, to this family, and now I was just an obstacle. But they didn't know something crucial about me, something I had hidden for decades. Before my mother passed away, she told me about a family property on Kemir Island, in the Caribbean, that I inherited when I turned 70. It was an oceanfront condo that had been rented for decades. The income had accumulated in an account I never touched. I also had investments from the inheritance of my Aunt Beatrice, who died childless and left everything to me. Bonds, stocks, certificates of deposit, money that quietly grew while I lived modestly on my pension. In total, I had nearly $420,000 that my family knew nothing about. They thought I was just an old woman living off government aid. They had no idea I had been financing their comfortable lives for years. Not because I had to, but because I loved them. But after the humiliation of Mother's Day, something inside me broke for good. It was time for them to understand Helen's true worth. That cruel card had been my awakening. I stayed awake all night, holding that piece of paper in my shaking hands, the words replayed in my mind. You're a constant weight. No one wants you around. But as the tears dried on my cheeks, something began to shift. The sorrow turned into something stronger, clarity, resolve. For the first time in decades, I saw my life for what it truly was. I wasn't a burden. I was the one keeping them afloat. I stood slowly and went to my bedroom. From the dresser, I pulled out a small cedar box I hadn't opened in months. Inside were my most important papers: bank records, property deeds, investment files. As I leafed through them, I made mental calculations that left me stunned. In the past 5 years, I had given Melissa and Ethan about $72,000. $72,000 they accepted as if it were owed to them while treating me worse each year. The down payment on their home, $27,000. The wedding, $11,000. Monthly help for 2 years, $13,200. The children's computers, $1,900. The car repair, $4,200. The kitchen remodel, $7,500. And smaller expenses totaling another $7,200. Meanwhile, I was still living in the same modest house, wearing my old maroon dress on Sundays, walking to the grocery store to save on fuel. But that wasn't the deepest wound. What truly shattered my heart was remembering how their treatment of me had changed. I remembered my oldest grandson's birthday 6 months earlier. I had arrived early to help decorate, as always, but when I knocked, Ethan opened the door with a look of irritation. "Helen, the party doesn't start until 3. Why are you here so soon?" "I thought I could help set things up," I said with a smile. "We've got it covered," he replied curtly. Behind him I saw his mother, Carol, hanging streamers in the living room. She had been invited to help. I was treated like an uninvited guest. "I can wait outside until 3, I murmured, humiliated. "Don't be dramatic, Mom," Melissa said, coming from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. "You can stay, just don't come into the kitchen. You always get mixed up with recipes." Mixed up with recipes? Me? The one who had cooked for that family for decades. That day, I sat quietly in a corner of the patio, a stranger at my own grandson's party. I watched as Carol helped prepare food, and guests praised her for the cake she'd baked. Meanwhile, I, who had paid for half of that celebration, was ignored completely. When it came time to sing happy birthday, I stayed in the back, while everyone formed a circle around my grandson. No one noticed I wasn't in the family photos. Later that evening, my grandson approached as I gathered dirty plates. "Grandma, why were you so quiet today?" "Just a little tired, sweetheart," I lied. "Grandma Carol says you're too old for big parties." His words pierced me like glass. Carol, who was only 3 years younger than me, was telling my own grandchildren that I was too old. Yet even after that humiliation, I kept helping, kept giving, kept hoping things might change. How foolish I had been. I also remembered last Christmas. I had bought expensive gifts for everyone. A new bicycle for the oldest grandson, a tablet for the youngest, designer perfume for Melissa, a power drill Ethan had once mentioned. I spent nearly $3,300 on presents. On Christmas Eve, I arrived with my arms full of carefully wrapped boxes. The kids rushed to greet me, but Melissa quickly called them back. "Kids, put Grandma's presents under the tree with the rest. We'll open everything together tomorrow." My gifts disappeared into the pile of packages they had bought themselves. When the time came to open them, no one said who had given what. The kids mumbled general thanks, but the most painful part came afterward. I had also brought a special gift for Melissa, a pearl necklace that had belonged to my grandmother. It was an antique piece, priceless to me and steeped in family history. "Mum, it's lovely," Melissa said, not even trying it on. "But you know I don't wear much jewellery. Maybe keep it for when the kids are older." She handed the box back without even opening the clasp to look at the pearls. I had imagined that moment for months, picturing my daughter wearing the same necklace that had graced 3 generations of women in our family. That night, in my empty house, I wept, holding that small box of pearls. It wasn't the monetary value that hurt. It was the indifference towards something that came straight from my heart. But the final blow came 2 months ago when I caught the flu. I spent a week in bed, fever hovering around 101 degrees. I could barely move, couldn't cook, could hardly make it to the bathroom. I called Melissa to ask if she could bring me something to eat, or at least check how I was doing. "Oh, Mom, we're just swamped right now. Ethan has a huge project at work and I'm pulling a double shift at the clinic. Can't you ask one of your neighbours? But sweetheart, I can hardly walk. Mum, you're not a child anymore. You need to learn to take care of yourself. We can't come running every time you catch a little cold." A cold. My fever had been over 101 degrees, and she called it a cold. She hung up and didn't call back for the entire week. It was Mrs. Turner, my 82-year-old neighbour, who brought me homemade soup and made sure I took my medication. A woman I barely knew showed more kindness than my own daughter. When I finally recovered and returned to visiting my family, no one asked how I had been. It was as if that awful week had never existed. And now, sitting with those bank papers spread out before me, I understood with painful precision what my role truly was in their lives. I wasn't the cherished grandmother. I was the emotional ATM. When they needed cash, there was Helen. When they needed free childcare, there was Helen. When they needed someone to absorb their frustration, there was Helen. But when Helen needed love, care, respect, or even a phone call during an illness, Helen disappeared. That night, I made the hardest decision of my life. I took out my old laptop and logged into my online banking for the first time in months. Major changes were overdue. First, I cancelled the automatic $550 monthly transfer to Melissa's account. Second, I closed the shared emergency savings account that only they ever used. Third, I changed my will. Everything I had once left to Melissa and Ethan would now go to a foundation for abandoned seniors. And fourth, I did something I never imagined I'd do. I bought a plane ticket. It was time to see the property I owned on Cayman Island. It was time to begin the life I truly deserved. But before leaving, I would make sure my family understood exactly what they had lost. It was Tuesday morning when I put my plan into motion. I had slept barely 3 hours, yet for the first time in years I felt entirely awake, absolutely certain. I dressed in my most elegant navy suit, the one I had bought for Melissa's college graduation but worn only once. I carefully applied my makeup and pinned my hair into a graceful bun. I wanted to look like the capable woman I had always been, not the fragile old lady they imagined. My first stop was the bank. My financial advisor, Mr. Whitaker, looked startled to see me so early. "Mrs. Helen, how can I assist you today?" "I need to make several important changes to my accounts," I said firmly. For the next 2 hours, I completely reorganized my finances. I cancelled every automatic transfer linked to Melissa's accounts. I closed the joint account we had opened 3 years earlier. I moved funds from my investments into my primary checking account. Are you sure about these transactions, Mum? Mr. Whitaker asked, clearly uneasy. They're substantial moves. I'm certain. It's my money and I'll decide how to use it. Then I went to my lawyer's office, Mr. Rosen, who had handled my family's affairs for decades. I need to rewrite my will completely, I said without preamble. Mr. Rosen, an older man who had known me since Melissa was a child, removed his glasses and studied me carefully. Helen, is everything all right? This seems like a serious change. Everything's perfectly fine, I replied. For the first time in years, I see things clearly. I told him exactly what I wanted. Everything previously intended for Melissa and Ethan would go to a charitable trust for elderly people without families. I also created a trust for my grandchildren, accessible only when they turned 25, and only if they had maintained genuine voluntary contact with me. Helen, perhaps you should take a few days to reconsider. These are permanent decisions. I've had 72 years to think, Mr. Rosen, and the last 5 have taught me all I need to know. I signed every document with a steady hand. There was no tremor, no hesitation. My next stop was the travel agency. I had spent the previous night researching my property on Kaymere Island. It was a 3-bedroom condominium in a lovely coastal neighborhood, managed by a rental company that had been accumulating income in an offshore account I'd never touched. I'd like to fly to Kaymere this Friday, I told the travel agent. Is this for vacation, Mom? No, I said with a calm smile. It's for freedom. I bought a first-class ticket. If I was going to start a new chapter, I would begin it with grace and style. But before leaving, there was one final task. I needed to write the letters. At noon, I sat at my desk and took out a box of fine stationery I'd bought years ago but never used. It was time to tell my family exactly what had happened. The first letter was for Melissa. My dearest daughter, by the time you read this letter, I will already be on my way to Kaymere Island, where I'll move into the property I inherited from our family, the one you never knew existed. I have decided to end all financial support I've been providing you over the years. The $550 monthly transfer has been permanently cancelled. The joint account you used for so-called emergencies has been closed. Please don't see this as punishment, but as a lesson in independence, one I should have taught you long ago. For decades, I gave you everything I possessed. My time, my savings, my strength, my unconditional love. But somewhere along the way, you began to see me as a burden instead of a blessing. That cruel Mother's Day card was simply the breaking point. The problem had begun much earlier, when you stopped seeing me as your mother and started treating me as your servant and personal banker. I have revised my will. What once was yours will now go to people who truly appreciate kindness and family devotion. Your children will have access to their trust when they turn 25, but only if they prove they can maintain a sincere bond with me. Do not seek me for money. Do not call me begging me to return. Do not use the grandchildren to stir my guilt. If you want your mother back, you'll have to prove that you value me for who I am, not for what I can give. Your mother, who has finally learned to value herself. Helen. The second letter was for Ethan. Ethan, I never saw you merely as my son-in-law. I welcomed you as the son I never had, yet you turned me into the inconvenient mother-in-law you were eager to discard. I heard your phone conversation 3 months ago when you talked about finding a proper place for me, as if I were some old piece of furniture in your way. What you didn't realize was that the proper place was already in my grasp. I own a home on Kaymere Island, hold investments that yield more than you earn in a year, and possess the freedom to live however I choose. For years, I quietly sustained your comfortable life, paying for repairs, covering bills, helping through your so-called emergencies. I did it out of affection, not duty. But you mistook my generosity for weakness, my presence for dependence, my love for nuisance. Now you'll have to stand firmly on your own. When I finished writing the letters, I sealed them in envelopes and left them on the coffee table, waiting to be found. Then I sat in my living room and smiled. It had taken me 72 years, but I had finally learned the most valuable lesson of my life. You teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept. For decades, I accepted scraps of affection because I was terrified of loneliness. But now I understood that being alone was infinitely better than living among those who didn't respect me. And once I realized that, I wasn't truly alone anymore. I was free. I was going to Kemir. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I felt thrilled about my life.